Before I begin my remarks, let me first apologize for the fact that as part of this first international conference on media ecology and image studies, I won't be incorporating PowerPoint slides or, in fact, any images at all into my presentation. And so for the next 15 minutes or so, the only image that you're going to see is my face, my talking head. As I said, I apologize for this if you expect something more or something better. However, as you'll come to understand, it's not really possible for me to include the kinds of images that are the eventual subject of this talk. Or perhaps you may have already guessed what I mean by that from my title. At the beginning of this year, 2018, I became editor of the journal, etc., a review of general semantics. It's a journal that has a very long and illustrious history. As a matter of fact, I became editor just in time for the journal's 75th anniversary. Etc. was founded in 1943 as the official organ of the Society for General Semantics, which a few short years later became the International Society for General Semantics. That organization sprang from yet another one, the Institute of General Semantics, which was founded in 1938 by Alfred Korzybski, and which still exists today. I am, in fact, also a member of the Board of Trustees of the IGS, along with Corey Anton, Lance Straight, and Edward Twoniak, all of whom, like me, are also former presidents of the Media Ecology Association. Korzybski is considered the father of general semantics and is author of two of the most important works in the GS tradition, Manhood of Humanity, The Science and Art of Human Engineering, published in 1921, and the groundbreaking Science and Sanity, An Introduction to Non-Aristotelian Systems and General Semantics, in 1933. Etc's first editor, and he remained in the position for some 27 years, was S.I. Hayakawa, author of Language and Thought in Action, president of then San Francisco State College and now San Francisco State University from 1969 to 1973, and U.S. Senator from California for one term from 1977 to 1983. Later, for 10 years, from 1977 through 1986, the editor of Etc. was a person whose name is well known in media ecology circles, Neil Postman. Etc. is also notable for having published an extraordinary list of noteworthy and transdisciplinary scholars and public intellectuals, including, and this is in chronological order, E.E. Cummings, Benjamin Lee Whorf, Abraham Maslow, Rudolf Carnap, Dorothy Lee, David Reisman, Carl Rogers, Warren Weaver, Gregory Bateson, Margaret Mead, Sir Karl Popper, Timothy Leary, Edmund Carpenter, Terence Moran, Langston Hughes, Paul Václavic, Joshua Meyerowitz, George Gerbner, Marshall McLuhan, Robert Logan, Jacques Ellul, Edward Bernays, Jay Rosen, Edward Havelock, Jacob Bernowski, Joseph Weizenbaum, John Updike, Alvin Toffler, Albert Ellis, Renee Hobbs, and okay, this last author is not in chronological order, the founding mother of media ecology, Christine Nystrom. Christine is the reason that I brought up Etc. as my introduction today. I've done so because my talk begins from the substance of an article that she published in the journal not long after Postman stepped down as editor. Her article was the lead piece in volume 44, number 2, published in the summer of 1987, and is an article that I highly recommend that you read. I first became aware of it, though, when she presented it as a paper at New York University's fall 1986 Media Ecology Conference at Sachs Lodge in Saugerties, New York. For those of you who know New York only as New York City, Saugerties is a small town located 100 miles north in New York State's beautiful Hudson Valley region and right on the edge of the bucolic Catskill Mountain Range. Christine's article title is a very simple one, Literacy as Deviance. A title that is also somewhat tantalizing, I'm sure. And I'm sure some of you are wondering, well, what might this have to do with the image? Unless, of course, I'm talking about media literacy, and I am. But I'm not talking about media literacy in the terms of the doctrinaire tradition that many of you recognize as the media literacy movement and media literacy education in the way that noted scholar Renee Hobbs teaches and writes about it. Media ecologists often reject the idea from this tradition that a media education is something one pursues on the way to becoming media literate. Media ecologists would rather say it this way. that we pursue a media education in order to become educated about media, in order to, in McLuhan's terms, understand media. Because to media ecologists, and in particular those influenced by Postman's brand of media ecology, literacy is a matter of verbal language. It is in particular a matter of print-based language and a print-based mindset and culture. In other words, media ecologists find a phrase like reading a film to be nonsensical. As Josh Meyerowitz counsels us, when was the last time you watched a book? And so to proceed, I will first explain a bit about Christine's argument in Literacy as Deviance as the foundation for my remarks. And I'll then use this summary to extend her argument to matters that she did not and really could not write about at that time, to both the present moment and our immediate future, and make my argument about the image, the moving image, image studies, and where I believe our image culture, or at least what we think of as the moving image, might be headed. Christine wrote her piece, as I said, in 1986, around the time the notion of post-literacy and post-literate culture first entered into our discourse. As you may know, Neil Postman's first book was Television and the Teaching of English, which he wrote as the lead author for the National Council of Teachers of English. The book was published at exactly the moment when television first took hold in U.S. culture, with all that that moment portended for a post-literate future. All it portended for the ways in which the culture of the image, to which Daniel Boorstin also opened our eyes at that time, had begun to point us to and lead us. With respect to the threat of the onset of post-literacy, Christine ostensibly asks, what's all the fuss about? She began, and I quote, "If I read it aright, our culture's belated and somewhat hysterical efforts to rescue literacy are at best misguided and in any case doomed." End quote. Now trust me, as one of the most supremely linear and literate minds that I have ever known, she went on to explain how she herself was not at all happy or positive or optimistic about the state of affairs, about the doom of which she was writing. From this, though, she built an argument that began, and I quote again, with the idea that the history of human invention is best read as a history of problem solving in response to change. And so following from this, the gist of her article is about the invention of writing, what it meant to our habits of mind and to the very nature of our mind as writing changed our minds, and what problem written communication was meant to solve in the face of what change. That is, at least to the minds of people like yourselves who read and write and who believe that it's important to consider, embrace, contest, and advance the ideas and learning contained in talks such as this one. Christine writes that for years, and I quote, "I've struggled to answer this question. Why do people watch TV when all the world of books, with all its incomparable riches, lie open to easy reach? Why don't they read? But I asked from the bias of literacy that has come to disdain the senses and delight in the pure play of mind. So I could not find any answer until I turned the question around. Not why don't people read, but why did they ever read? And the answer is so simple that you will think I say it in jest. We read because we couldn't invent TV." In other words, one reading of Literacy as Deviance is that literate, and in particular the print literate mode of human communication, perhaps served only the following place in the history of our human species. It took print literacy and the attendant rise of modern universities, the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, the legal concept of intellectual property and its incentive system of authorship and ownership, and the like, to develop and devise the ideas that undergird our modern and now postmodern technological advances and inventions. Because Christine was writing at the onset of the personal computer revolution, at the very same moment that Steve Jobs, Steve Wozniak, and Ronald Wayne were incorporating Apple Computer, a year after Bill Gates and Paul Allen founded the Microsoft Corporation, and 4 years before Microsoft signed its deal with IBM, to provide an operating system as the basis for IBM's line of PCs. Because of this, Christine hedged her bets and did not say where computers might be leading us. Nonetheless, one of her most emphatic points was clear. We could not and would not have reached this juncture in human history and have what we have as our technologies of media communication were it not for the gift of our written and print modes, which enabled the full extent of learning and knowledge by which we conceive and build our machines. As a result, what she is in fact saying is that it's not just the invention of television that is the problem print literacy was meant to solve. It is also the technologies that, at the time of her writing, were only rudimentary science, applied science, science fiction. Literacy solved the problems that have allowed our internet and mobile internet, robotics and robots, augmented reality, and the technology that I will talk about for the remainder of my address, virtual reality. And so let me begin this final portion of my talk by pointing out the following. Since our species' earliest forays into the representation of our experience, and with the exception of oral speech communication and some of our artistic or presentational symbolic forms, such as dance and music, with the exception of these, we have been refashioning our representations on two-dimensional surfaces, from stone to clay to papyrus to vellum to paper and finally to screens. And it was at the turn of the 19th into the 20th century that we first developed what is to date the representational form that presents and remains the closest analog of our lived experience, film. By the 1960s, of course, this expands as moving images into television and video. In other words, with the exception of some of our arts, and I did fail to mention a moment ago, and should point out the three-dimensional art form that is sculpture, we have been engaging vis-a-vis our media with flat, secondary worlds of our own making for 40,000 plus years. With respect to the moving images of the past century or so, we have been suspending disbelief while staring, always from some distance, at analogs of what we see and hear and experience in real time, that is REAL time, in the real world. Well, following from Christine, there's a problem that remains to be solved here with respect to our moving images. Actually, a few problems. First, why should all of our representations, save for sculpture, be flat? Second, why should they be works wherein we are effectively required to suspend disbelief with respect to the fact that they were produced in the past? Third, why must we perceive these representations from an objective distance? Finally, and I offer this as my most emphatic point, what comes next in the problem-solving based history of our media of human communication? And if you'll forgive the word, what comes naturally? From the simultaneous histories of A, analog images from our cave paintings to portraiture to photographic images and to the moving images of film and video, and B, of our more abstracted digital forms of storytelling that are the poetry of oral cultures, to written stories, and to the rise of literature and the novel in our print-based age. Well, the answer to what comes next is virtual reality. In sum, while virtual reality gaming systems such as Facebook's Oculus Go, Sony's PlayStation VR, Samsung's Gear VR, and HTC's Vive were huge hits in the consumer electronics market following their introduction and during the Christmas 2016 and 2017 holidays, and of course for teenage boys. But recent sales data are suddenly pointing downward. Now, had I the time here, if it were not going to take me off on a tangent away from my main point, I could discuss some of the reasons why this sudden dip has occurred. But my point is this. While Jaron Lanier pioneered VR technology with his partner Thomas Zimmerman and their company VPL Research all the way back in 1985, the technology is still now only in its infancy and rearing its head thus far primarily in gaming. Lanier wrote about VR this past year in rather positive and hopeful terms in his book, Dawn of the New Everything. Despite the media ecological concerns and doubts that he's raised and articulated in all of his other recent books, with respect to the present-day media culture for which he and his fellow digital pioneers are largely responsible. But it is my argument that VR's success, its adoption, its arrival as a media advance and a next step in our media history is inevitable. It is inevitable with respect to what we will from here on in refer to as immersive entertainment. It is inevitable because immersive entertainment solves the problems I raised earlier. It solves the problem of our moving images being flat, being two-dimensional. It solves the problem of us attending to moving image-based entertainments that were obviously produced in the past, as these new immersive entertainments will effectively be interactive to the point that they blur Roland Barthes' distinction between work and text. The work will be created in the act, in the moment, in real time. It solves the problem that is watching from an objective distance. We will experience our entertainments from within and as participants in the story. We will be immersed, and it will all be wholly subjective. Another way of saying this is not that our moving image-based entertainments will end, that they will be consigned to the dustbin of media history like 78 RPM records and microfiche and CD-ROMs. They will, however, and in accordance with Marshall and Eric McLuhan's laws of media, become functionally obsolete. I'll tell you that with these thoughts in mind, we have at my college skipped over renaming our academic program in broadcasting and telecommunications as a concentration in video production and have decided to call it media production. I will tell you that we purchased a VR camera for our college's open house for prospective students and their parents, where in our gymnasium on one end of campus, they could take a virtual tour of our television studio and decide whether they were interested enough to walk to the other end of campus and take the real reality tour of our facility. But I have one more, as I said earlier, emphatic point to make here. And that is my answer for the moment, to the question, why will this take place? Why, am I arguing, is it inevitable? Well, this comes down to what I remember from the question and answer period after Christine first presented literacy as deviance as a talk. I remember the conversation turning to the idea of a teleology in our communication history, a sense that our inventions and innovations in media are moving forward towards some end game, some ultimate purpose. And from what I recall, this teleology has something to do, or everything to do, with the human impulse that is storytelling. In this telling of this history, virtual reality and immersive entertainment are not a final step, not by any means, but are only the latest and next step toward the final purpose in why we, as a species that have always told stories, and why we have sought to develop technological means to make our stories more real, more lifelike, and closer to our experience as we live it. Well, the answer is that the end game is trying to not only tell, but to control our own stories. The answer is that as we move through simulations where we can spend our time interacting in ways and in contexts that mimic our real world, which are controlled environments over which we will also have some control in determining the action and the outcome. Well, this is merely a part of the endeavor by which we seek to control both those environments and control the action and outcome, and wherein we will ultimately choose to spend our time in that world rather than in the world into which we are born and the fates to which we are born. In other words, VR is the next step in a communication and technological history wherein we ultimately seek to become and think we can become God in control of our own experience and our own existence. Thank you.